My name is Cindy Borden, and I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, where it is our mission to end veteran homelessness. Join us here each week as we use an equity lens to explore how specific demographic characteristics impact an individual's ability to access safe and affordable housing.
We want to take this time to acknowledge and thank the Home Depot Foundation for sponsoring this podcast and for continuing to fund veterans housing throughout the country. For roughly a decade, the Home Depot Foundation has remained committed to supporting the mission and work of NCHV. Their continued partnership means more housing availability for veterans and hopefully one day an end to veteran homelessness. The Home Depot Foundation works to improve the homes and lives of U.S. veterans, train skilled tradespeople to fill the labor gap, and support communities impacted by natural disasters. The Foundation's Veteran Housing Grants Program awards grants to nonprofit organizations for the new construction or rehabilitation of permanent supportive housing for veterans. Since 2011, the Foundation has invested more than $375 million in veteran causes and improved more than 50,000 veteran homes and facilities. The Foundation has pledged to invest $500 million in veteran causes by 2025 and $50 million in training the next generation of skilled tradespeople through the Path to Pro program. We'll be highlighting some of their work as we talk about various affordable housing developments throughout this series. If you're developing projects that support veterans exiting homelessness or would like to learn more about how the Home Depot Foundation is making a difference and continues to serve those who serve, visit homedepotfoundation.org.
Welcome back to the Road Home Podcast. This episode will focus on the intersection between race and ethnicity and housing. We know that people of color, especially Black people, experience homelessness disproportionately. The dramatic overrepresentation of Black people in the overall homeless population extends to include specific subsets, including families and veterans. It seems clear that there is a connection between race, socioeconomic status, and housing access. But what exactly is that connection? Where does it come from? And what can we do about it? That is what we'll talk about today. We start our conversation with Eric Tars from the National Homelessness Law Center, who will give us a quick review of what we mean by housing as a human right. He'll talk about the history of housing in this country and how centuries of racism and colonialism impact poverty, generational wealth, and access to affordable housing. Then he'll discuss redlining, steering, and other policies that continue to impact housing access today. And finally, he'll propose a path forward that focuses on the components of housing as a human right. In the second half of the episode, we'll talk to Melinda Clemmons and Briana Mason of Enterprise Community Development, who will share information about the Equitable Path Forward initiative. This comprehensive initiative focuses on providing BIPOC developers with the capital, technical assistance, leadership skills, and peer networks they need to succeed. We have a lot of information for you today and want to thank our guests for sharing with us. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Road Home Podcast. We're thrilled today to have Eric Tars with us from the National Homelessness Law Center. Eric, can you take a minute to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about who you are and the organization you're with?
Sure. Again, I'm Eric Tars. I'm the legal director here at the National Homelessness Law Center. We see ourselves as a legal arm of the national movement to end and prevent homelessness, and so trying to act in service of people experiencing homelessness as well as the organizations that serve them. And provide them with the tools of kind of the legal toolbox. That's policy advocacy, but also the unique thing that we can do, which is litigation and trying to help individuals who are facing criminalization on the streets, homeless youth who may be being denied access to school, but also looking at things like organizations that are trying to site in a community and are having zoning or other barriers put in the way of them being able to operate their programs, or programs that aren't being implemented properly, and needing to make sure that government itself is being held accountable for the kinds of things that they're supposed to be doing on behalf of people experiencing homelessness.
Great. We're thrilled to have you here. So last week's episode, we talked about this framework of housing justice, and we spent a little bit of time talking about what it means for housing to be a human right. Could you just give a brief sort of refresher for folks who may have missed that episode of what we're talking about when we say housing as a human right?
From my perspective at this legal organization, I think it's really important to say that housing as a human right is both a moral and a legal concept. That you've got this great moral and rhetorical tool where you see people chanting in the streets, housing is a human right. You see folks like Representative Cori Bush up on the steps of the Capitol camping out for housing as a human right, to extend the eviction moratorium, and really holding the nation's conscience to account using that framework. And just at an individual level, when you speak to a person experiencing homelessness and say, you have the right to housing just inherent in you as part of your own basic human dignity, that's really something that resonates. And it can change the way they approach things, because with a right to housing, people demand their rights. You beg for charity, but you demand your rights. And so that's really the shift that we're trying to make here, is that we aren't coming to the government to say you should, be nice to people experiencing homelessness. You should be nice to people living in inadequate housing conditions, but it's all right to have fully adequate housing that meets all of our basic needs, allows us to live with dignity. And that's at the international level. The other piece of this, as I said, is the legal components. So it's not just a catchy slogan, but there are 7 different elements of the human right to housing: legal security of tenure, your right to stay in your home, affordability, accessibility, habitability, location, access to services, materials, and infrastructure, and cultural adequacy. All of the things that come together to make housing not just a roof and 4 walls around you, but something that's really, like I said, the underlying principle is that it has to be enough so that you can live a life with dignity, and live a full life with all of your other human rights intersecting and being respected as well. And so that's why I think it's a really powerful tool for us as legal advocates, but also as a movement building component that can really lay the basis for good policy for everyone.
Great. Thank you for that. That was a great sort of overview refresher on that. So one of the other things we talked about in the first episode, in connection to housing as a human right and this idea of housing justice, is sort of a little bit about the history and the context of race and racism, and how that affects the ability of people, specifically people of color, to access housing that is safe, affordable, accessible. And we want to get into that a little bit more for this episode. So why is it that people of color, and specifically Black people, are overrepresented in the homelessness population?
Yeah, and I'll just start off by saying that when we're talking about people of color, we usually say BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, because while all people of color, including Black and Indigenous people, are impacted, they are also impacted in unique ways. And so the BIPOC term helps to emphasize that there are commonalities, but there are also unique differences in the way each of these groups experiences discrimination and the impacts of discrimination. And so kind of with that, I'll just say that from the founding of this country, before the founding of this country, from the time that the first settlers set foot, European settlers set foot on the American continent, we've had effectively a system of affirmative action for people of European descent to get access to housing, to land, to resources that people of color did not have access to. So whether it was, colonists coming and taking land away from indigenous tribes and then, appropriating it, building their housing on it at, no cost, not paying the cost to do that, to, 2-3 decades of chattel slavery, or centuries of chattel slavery, rather, where you have Black people systematically prevented from building wealth and having wealth extracted from them in order to build the wealth of the white families who enslaved them. Then after slavery ended, you have the creation of Jim Crow, where Black people started to build wealth, you could see it all wiped away in a day, as, with the various wealth or race riots and lynchings and driving people out of areas where they started to, actually build a community that was successful for themselves, up into redlining taking place under the New Deal, and with the return of veterans from World War II, the GI Bill, not having those resources accessible to BIPOC communities, really shifting tons of federal resources into the building of the suburbs, grabbing land cheaply, building housing on it, making that accessible to white people, not to Black people, and all of that, just centuries of putting federal resources, state resources, local resources into building wealth for white families only. And so now you get to this point where you have Black communities that have indigenous and other people of color all being denied those resources for so long. They just don't have the wealth individually within their families or within their entire networks. And so whereas a white family today, even, if they go through some hard times, they might be able to call a friend and say, can you get me rent for next month? And or fall back on another friend and say, we need to crash with you for a month. Is that okay? Black families, indigenous and other people of color, there's this network impoverishment issue, so that any little thing, they go to call that friend for the rent, the friend doesn't have it either. And so they are more likely to end up on the streets. They go to try and stay with a friend, but because that friend lives in public housing, they aren't allowed to have overnight guests. And so, and actually hosting one of their family or friends might get them both kicked out onto the streets. And so there's just no give in that system. And so even though we know that the rates of poverty for people of color are largely double that of whites, the rates of homelessness are double again. So even more than would be predicted by poverty alone. And we think that it's that network impoverishment piece that is the multiplier factor, that any little thing that might be just a small setback for a white family, there's just no resources to make up for that in BIPOC families. And so they end up on the streets. Then once they're there, they're subject to criminalization for simply not having a home. So whether it's anti-camping laws, anti-panhandling laws, their communities are passing these ordinances that make it a crime to try to survive outdoors. And while those are generally applicable to everybody experiencing homelessness, certain communities are targeted more by police already. So, BIPOC communities, LGBTQ, disabled communities. And so again, you've got this multiplier effect of these laws harm all people experiencing homelessness, but they're going to harm and be targeting certain communities more. And so, with all of this, nobody's making enough to pay the rent today. These bad housing policy, criminalization, these policies all harm all of us, but they also impact certain communities more. And both things are true at the same time. So this is definitely not saying that, there aren't white people experiencing homelessness, aren't white people experiencing poverty, but just as a collective, because of this, centuries history of systemic racism, not just individual racism, that continues today. These systems continue to perpetuate, even if individuals within it aren't acting as individually racist manners, that it's going to impact BIPOC communities more.
Wow, there was so much in that, Eric. I'm not sure where to go to. There's so many things that I think we could dive into a little bit deeper, but it sounds like you're saying there's both a generational component of this. There's also an inter-system component, inter-systems. It's not just the homelessness system, it's the legal system. It's all of these different things playing into the fact that BIPOC people are experiencing homelessness at rates beyond what they should. They're overrepresented. I did want to go back a little bit to some of the historical piece, because you mentioned a whole bunch of things in there. But for folks who might not know, when we say like redlining or steering, what do we mean by that? What was that? And is it still happening?
Yeah, so the official redlining policy developed its name from literal red lines that were drawn on maps when the Federal Housing Authority was giving out loans to people, to veterans coming back from the war, but for also through other programs to buy homes in kind of this post-war period. And the red lines were drawn around communities where they would not give those loans out because they deemed them too risky. And those lines were specifically drawn around BIPOC communities. And one of the criteria for having a green line drawn around your community for being a place where they would lend was in fact having racially restrictive covenants or legal segregation to keep those folks who they deemed not welcome out of those neighborhoods. So literally, Black people weren't able to get loans to buy homes in their own communities, and they weren't able to get loans to buy them in more white communities. And this was just millions and billions of dollars being invested into building wealth for white families that was not accessible to Black families. And so you then kind of flash forward to today, although legal redlining was abolished with the Civil Rights Act of 1968, you'd say, oh, it's been 50, 60 years since those laws were in effect. If you look at the areas that were redlined back then, there are so many demographic characteristics that are still remain true for those areas today. So they are still deeply impoverished. They are still, communities where you can't get access to decent education. There's still areas where you don't have access to, healthy food. They're food deserts. There's no hospitals in those areas. There's fewer fire departments and police departments in those areas. And it's all of these things that the resources were systemically sucked out of those areas and put into white areas. And so that's, while the practice per se is not legal today, we do continue to see hundreds, thousands of cases brought each year for racial steering for real estate agents, just not showing different people, different houses. So a white family, they might say, oh, you probably don't want to look at that house. It's, in a high crime neighborhood, or they'll use euphemisms that, they don't have good schools in that area to steer people away from there. And then Black families similarly won't be shown houses in white areas. Oh, you're not going to feel comfortable there. They'll make up some reason that they won't even show houses or show apartments. And so that informal steering that perpetuates these historical segregation patterns is still going on today, even though it's not legal. And so, yeah, it's not legal today, but it certainly is still showing its impacts.
And so connected to that, I think recently there have been some stories about, even for those BIPOC communities, those individuals who've been able to purchase homes, that there may even be discrimination in the appraisal process and those sorts of things. Is that something that you guys have heard as well?
Yes, yeah. So we've seen recent reports that, individual who kind of went in with their own application for an appraisal, got one price, even though other homes on their block were getting, double that. And then when they sent in a white friend and said, like, this is my home, can you appraise it? It appraised for, the same as the other homes on the block were doing. So yeah, so that's another way that wealth, even when people have overcome all of these hurdles to accessing home ownership, and they're trying to use it to build wealth, that wealth is still being denied through these systems, and then preventing it from being kind of handed on to the next generation or out into their further networks.
So given all of this, what do you think the path forward is to trying to address these historical inequities, the institutional racism? You talked a little bit about the different systems interplaying. You mentioned food deserts and healthcare and like all of those things interplaying. What do we do moving forward to try and make sure that BIPOC people have that access to housing that's safe, that's affordable, that's accessible?
Well, again, I think this is where we can come back to housing as a human right, and looking at those 7 different elements to make sure it's a comprehensive right that's going to address all those individual pieces. And so we should be looking at legislation and constructing it and measuring it against those principles. Is this something that's going to advance the right to housing in, for example, a program that provides a right to counsel in eviction courts is something that's going to help ensure the legal security of tenure for the residents of apartments, or, it can be expanded to foreclosure cases for people who own their homes. And that's a program that's going to help everybody. Again, it will help all renters, but it will have a disproportionate benefit to people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who are disproportionately renters because they have been historically denied these home ownership opportunities. And so a program like Right to Counsel is a great sort of equitable step in the direction of the right to housing. It's something that's going to help everybody, but it's going to provide its benefits to the lowest income, the most vulnerable people first. And so that's kind of how we should be thinking about things. In addition to that, I really started off this discussion by framing all of that historical practice as affirmative action purposefully, because we know today that affirmative action programs are really under attack. That in most places, in most kind of areas of law, it's not even allowed anymore, or if it is, it's extremely limited. And the human rights framework says to us that not only are these kind of special measures to make up for historical discrimination allowed, but it says they're required. And so bringing that into our legal analysis as well as into practical policy will help us take those steps that we need, because you can't just take 3 centuries of just giving white people more advantages than Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and then stop, theoretically stop in 1968, and then say, all right, everybody, it's all equal now. You have these kind of metaphors of the 2 runners, one starting 50 yards ahead of the other one. It's not a surprise when that one keeps winning. We need to do something to help move that second runner up to the same starting line at least. And what that is affirmative action. So actual preferences for access to housing funding, to higher education, to whatever it might be, and people, white people today are complaining, well, these people shouldn't be getting special favors. My family made it on their own, but no, they didn't make it on their own. They made it because of all these advantages that weren't recognized as affirmative action back then. But in fact, there generations of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have been denied, have seen opportunities being given just to one population. And so turning around and saying now, in order to make up for that, we need to be able to give make some programs available just to certain populations is the fair and equitable thing to do.
Thank you for that, Eric. I appreciate it. Is there any last things you want to say about sort of the intersection between race, economics, access to housing, as we look forward to other episodes of the podcast?
I think I'll just end it again with this concept that where bad policies hurt us all, the good policies help us all, and being conscious of race in this is really important, because if you aren't conscious of it, you're not going to be designing the policies for the populations that are impacted the most. And it's okay to do both things at the same time. It's okay to recognize specific communities have been harmed more and need more assistance now, but those are policies that are going to benefit everybody. Because if you don't want that homeless encampment on your corner, if you don't want that homeless veteran needing to beg on the side of the road, then these equitable policies are the ones that are actually going to make that happen most effectively and most efficiently. And you need the voices of the people who are experiencing those things integrated into the policymaking process in order to make sure that that's happening.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. It's been a great conversation. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Eric, for that great foundation of how race and ethnicity impact the ability to obtain safe, accessible, and affordable housing, and to create generational wealth. Our next interview looks at a unique approach to addressing these barriers and inequities. In contrast to traditional strategies that focus on those in need of housing, we'll hear more about an initiative that focuses on BIPOC housing developers. Let's hear what Melinda and Briana have to say.
Great. Thank you for having us, Cindy. My name is Melinda Clemmons, and I am the Vice President and Central Midwest Market Leader at Enterprise Community Partners. So I cover Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and our Indiana markets.
Hi, Cindy. My name is Briana Mason. I'm our program officer here in Detroit. I focus on a lot of our programmatic work here at Enterprise, such as our Section 4 work, faith-based development, as well as community development organization fund. I work with the Elevating Group, which is a smaller subset of the CDL fund.
Welcome. Well, we're thrilled to have both of you here, Melinda and Briana. We're excited about the conversation today. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what Enterprise is and what Enterprise does. And if Enterprise has any specific work in the veteran arena, that would be great, but just an overview of Enterprise's work.
Yeah, so we are a national nonprofit affordable housing organization. We are actually the authority on affordable housing. And we just celebrated our 40th year anniversary. So excited about that. And what
Congratulations, that's great.
Thank you. And over those 40 years, Cindy, we've been able to preserve almost 900,000 homes and deploy over $50 billion in funding. So we're an intermediary for affordable housing, not only for development, but also for programmatic work. We aggregate capital and we focus on policies, not only on the federal level, but also on the state and local level. So really overall, a social impact organization, how can we advance our cities around the country in which we're located that have been under-resourced?
We're thrilled you're here. I want to hear a little bit more about Enterprise's work in racial equity. I know it's one of your key impact areas and one of the things that you're focusing on.
Well, racial equity is important, I think, for Enterprise, but also for our country as a whole. So at Enterprise, we focus on how can we make systematic change? How do we reduce barriers that have been up for decades that have shut people out of opportunities? And so our work in affordable housing is a great complement because 50% of people who live in affordable housing are BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so for us to then layer on a focus through an equity lens really complements our work.
Thank you, Briana. How would you describe the connection between access to affordable housing and race in this country?
They're intertwined, they're connected. I mean, you look at majority of our cities are, primarily people of color, people who are lower to medium income, and who are just trying to get by, trying to make sure that their kids get a great education and are in safe environments. So, especially in areas such as Detroit, where we have 80% of our population is African American, we have no choice but to focus on affordable choices and housing for residents.
How do you think Enterprise's focus on racial equity can help address some of those systemic barriers? We know that, Detroit was definitely one of those places where redlining was rampant. How does your work help to address those barriers, those systemic barriers to affordable housing access?
Well, there's a couple of different ways that we do that in Detroit, but also how Enterprise does it within our programmatic work. There's three major ways I can tell you how we do that in Detroit. And then some of these are programs that we actually provide nationwide. So we work currently to deploy Section 4 grants to our community development organizations who work directly with residents in affordable housing. We have been doing that since I would say the inception of Enterprise. We're one of 3 organizations that provide Section 4 grants. LISC and Habitat for Humanity are the other 2. And what that does is provide these organizations with money so that they can be able to fund their staff, be able to get training, as well as equipment to provide access to affordable housing for residents. With that being said, in Detroit, it has resulted in us being able to help folks, especially in the racial equity realm, through being able to help BIPOC developers, such as, for example, we've helped Sonia Mays who is the director over at Develop Detroit, who's been working to provide affordable housing here in Detroit. They just recently did a ribbon cutting for their Freelawn Sugar Hill development, which we were able to provide them with a Section 4 grant to pay their staff to be able to actually implement that project. It's 68 units, and 14 units of those are dedicated to veterans.
Solving the racial inequities in our housing system and in our society requires us to think big picture. It requires a big tent approach. So all of the issues we work on, whether it's housing affordability, disaster recovery, climate resilience, healthy housing, and more, we know all of these issues disproportionately impact communities of color. And right now that we're in the post-George Floyd America, we're starting to see institutions and governments talking more about racial equity and how they can act on that. And they're coming to enterprise and like organizations, figuring out what they can do to combat the problem.
That's great. Thank you. So I know you said there's a lot of different things that Enterprise is doing. One of the initiatives I'd like to hear a little bit more about, you mentioned this idea about working with developers. Can you talk a little bit about your Equitable Path Forward initiative and what that is and how it works?
Absolutely. So what we've come to understand is that the inequities that our communities face are the same as the industry. People of color actually live in affordable housing at a rate of nearly 50%, but yet only 2% of developers of color actually own those organizations and those real estate projects. And so we're really challenging the real estate community to think about development differently. How can we pull new levers to change the way in which development in our system works? So that led us to create a program called the Equitable Path Forward. And what it is, instead of investing in projects, sticking bricks where we have collateral, we are actually investing in the organizations themselves, which is really a paradigm shift. We're creating products that allow our developers to use unsecured lines of credit to either cover pre-development costs or organizational costs and capacity building. And we haven't seen development thought of in that way in quite some time.
Yeah, it sounds, I don't want to necessarily say revolutionary, but a completely different approach than what we usually hear about when we're talking about racial justice and access to housing. And so what made Enterprise choose to focus on BIPOC housing developers as opposed to the more traditional approach of actually focusing on the folks who are trying to find the housing themselves?
So we focus on both. So we actually still fund stick and bricks and we fund real estate projects, but we realized when we talked to our stakeholders that the biggest source of capital needed was that early stage money. And so that's why we decided to focus on investing in the organizations as a whole, because that was the capital that was the hardest for them to get. And we know whoever owns the housing gets to choose who gets to stay in the housing. And because we know that housing is a human right and home begins with the house, we decided that focusing on BIPOC ownership and development was the best way for us to advance our work.
So you mentioned a little bit about that early capital being the hardest to access, and it's certainly something that we've heard in previous seasons of our podcast when we talk about it. But I want to hear a little bit more when you say like who owns the housing decides to be who helps decide who gets the housing. How have you seen this connection between access to equity for these BIPOC developers leading to more affordable housing for BIPOC communities?
Well, what we've seen to date is that our developers want to invest in the communities in which they live. They also want to invest in others who look like them in their community. And so a lot of our developers tell us before they even access any of our programs that they're looking as a way to advance their communities and build wealth and use it as a mode of economic development.
And so it sounds like, and you may have just answered this question a little bit, but do you see Equitable Path Forward is actually helping to sort of rectify or fix some of the harm that was done by some of these other policies that we've talked about, exclusionary zoning and redlining and all those kinds of things?
I would say it's a good start. We have so far to go. The program has been well received. However, decades and decades of illegal redlining and disinvestment is going to take more than one program in order for us to really start to see some of the change. However, we and our partners believe that once we pilot this and we show the impact and the scale that we can do, that we can continue with this type of work so we can really see a move in the needle.
So how does it work, without getting in too much of the nitty-gritty details, but if I was a BIPOC developer that was interested in being part of Equitable Path Forward, what would I do? How would I get involved to get access to some of that early capital and be part of that initiative?
Sure, you would reach out to your local market and your partner, and you will talk to them a little bit about your business and what your goals are and where you're seeing a lack of capital within your organization. At that point, we have a team that works on Equitable Path Forward, would then have a meeting with you, talk more about what your needs are. I think another thing that's very interesting about Equitable Path Forward is that it also includes a technical assistance pool. And so not only do you receive funding for your organization, but you also receive the ability to have technical assistance. So you may receive a line of credit, but also ask for a technical assistance engagement to help you with succession plan or to help you understand what your HR benefits are for your employees. So by putting the two things together, you're able to take the work farther. And so that first entry point would be either talking to someone in your local jurisdiction, or also we have a website that you can reach out to and put an inquiry through for the EPFT.
So it sounds like it's a really comprehensive approach. It's not just the financing side, if you will, of development. It's also investing in the capacity, the capability of the organization, of the developer, to make sure that they can take the project the whole way. So they have access to the capital they need, but also the expertise that they may need in other areas of their operations.
Absolutely. We also have a component that we haven't touched on yet, which is a standby guarantee. And so I'm sure you're familiar, Cindy, where we have our developers of color who have to give up a majority of their developer fee in order to partner with an organization that has experience. And so what we're able to do with regulated units is provide a standby guarantee so a developer can then take on a project on their own and it has a better economic impact for them and their organization. A final component we have of the program is a leadership component. And we are in partnership with Howard University for a rotational analyst program in which we are building a pipeline of leaders to do this work. So our analysts sit for 8 months in 3 different parts of enterprise. And at the end of that, they will then have affordable housing experience and they can underwrite and originate loans, which will then give them the skill sets that they can go anywhere in this country and work.
Wow. So there really is so many different facets of this initiative that are really touching on many of the different barriers. I'm curious, how are you and how will you measure the impact of Equitable Path Forward? And sort of a related question is, how do you measure impact and what does success look like? What is the maybe not end goal, because as you mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of things to fix, and things have been broken for so long. But what does that long-term success look like?
Well, I think first, short-term success, I'm happy to say that we have had so much demand for this product that we've already completed a tranche of our funding to get our lending product out. So we've already lent close to $200 million to developers across the country. And that includes about 60 different organizations. We're going to track their long-term success over the 5-year period of the program. So we're going to be looking at, were they able to grow their organizations? Were they able to grow their personal balance sheets? How has wealth in their communities changed? What about the wealth of their tenants? Have home values increased in their neighborhoods? So we'll be looking at a lot of different performance indicators to see what has worked and what may need tweaking for another version of the program.
And so you mentioned it's a 5-year program right now. When was the first, when did it start, and how much? You said 200 million so far. What is the amount that you're hoping to give out over that 5 years?
So we're hoping to give out 350 million over the 5-year period, and 15 million of that is for technical assistance. 10 million of it will be for our leadership component, and then the other balance will be for our unsecured lines of credit. And the 5-year program runs from, it started last year in 2021, and it's going to go through 2026.
So we're about a year in, and it sounds like you've already done quite a lot of work already. Wow. So there's so much here to unpack, and I'm sure there are other questions that people were probably thinking. I'm just thinking of, what can people do to support this work, or are there other models or approaches that you know of that are complementary to what Enterprise is doing with Equitable Path Forward, or that could to help you take this to the next level?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that we can all participate in, especially within Michigan, to kind of move the work forward. Currently, right now, Enterprise is working with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, and we're working to look at the qualified allocation plan for low-income housing tax credits. We're looking to see if there are some racial equity things that can be done to impact policies and practices for that particular program type. So we're looking for developers to participate in that focus group. Chicago has already done this. They had a racial equity impact assessment, and that's what we're currently working on in Michigan. And we are hoping that this is going to inform some of the things that are currently happening within the policies and practices of the QAP. So as many developers that can participate in that, that would be amazing. In addition to that, we have worked with our local philanthropic that really pushes community development organizations, especially those in housing, to be able to fund their staff. So we have this program here in Detroit, and it's also located in New Orleans, called the Community Development Organization Fund. What we do is we provide and have deployed over $6 million in the last 3 years to community development organizations here in Detroit. What that is able to entail is that those organizations are able to pay their staff salaries, they're able to provide them with training, and they're also able to learn from each other, network with each other, and provide additional services to residents that they have.
So as you can see, Cindy, we're really trying to take some of the best practices from our programs, from our CDO fund that is managed here through Briana and also through Equitable Path Forward, and put the pieces together that are necessary to be successful. So our current Community Development Organization Fund primarily is led by executive directors of color, or they serve populations of color. And we know that they need the same things that our national developers do. They need access to capital. They also need technical assistance, and they need the ability to learn from each other. So another component of the program that I didn't touch on was the peer exchange. And so the CDO fund, as well as Equitable Path Forward, has peer exchange so that organizations can learn best practices from one another. What kind of policy agenda should they be pushing forward? What are things that they're experiencing in their communities that others may not be experiencing, and then give them the insights on how to overcome those obstacles?
So it sounds like you're creating a community of support, of learning, of expertise within of BIPOC developers that have been sort of traditionally shut out of those communities of the traditional white large white developers, and you're sort of creating this. Community is the best word I can come up with, but maybe you can come up with another one. Is that a good description of it?
It is. And so we use the word ecosystem. We're trying to create an ecosystem that not only works for our mid-sized developers and our larger developers, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, but also how do we support our community development organizations in doing this work? So that way we are focused on the entire ecosystem and we can move the needle and see results over a 5-year time frame that encourages our friends and other investors to continue this work because they're able to see the impact.
We're also looking at it from a non-traditional lens as well. We have faith-based organizations that we currently work with that are doing housing development or own a lot of property, and have not been able to get traditional lines of credit or traditional lending resources. So we're looking at that as well and exploring how we can support them, especially here in Detroit. We have what Melinda would say, a church and a liquor store on every corner. And so if that is the case, and they are anchor institutions for communities, how can we push their work forward to make sure that they can build ecosystems around their churches and around their congregation so that they can stabilize their neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's a really interesting approach, and that, churches are anchors in their communities, and they also, as you said, often have extra land, but also as part of their ministry, they may be wanting to create affordable housing and help those who are unhoused. And sort of how do they get access to some of those, to that capital that they might not be able to access through traditional financial institutions?
Correct. And also the technical assistance. How do they get the wherewithal in order to be able to develop an affordable housing project? Our faith-based organizations are excellent at encouraging and giving to the community, but not necessarily all of them know how to do an affordable housing project, which can be very complex. So that's one of the roles that we're trying to play, and we're really leading that work out of our Mid-Atlantic office with our market leader, David Bowers, who's been doing it for 15 years for Enterprise Community Partners.
Yeah, when you think about development, it is a complex world, right? And trying to figure out tax cuts and all of those things and permitting all of that stuff and financing and layering, and not having that technical knowledge, even if you have the desire, could be a barrier. So it's great that you guys are trying to break down all of those barriers. I'm curious, this is, as you said, the Equitable Path Forward is a 5-year project, and you're hoping, as you see the impacts and you'll have these measurable impacts, that other folks will join this. What do you see as the biggest obstacle to success here, and not only to success with this initiative, but ongoing and getting more people involved and more people connected and investing in our developers and BIPOC developers, but also in development, creating affordable housing in general?
I'll start and then I'll let Melinda finish. I think the first barrier is the policies and procedures that are currently in place, especially within lending, within state level politics, within local level politics, looking at those and examining those and seeing how that impacts racial equity across the nation is a very important thing. I mean, we've started this work in Chicago, looking at the racial equity assessment, and now we're doing that in Michigan. What if everyone took that approach to look at and analyze how we're doing low income tax credits, and how we're able to deploy those efforts? But in addition to that, also looking at the community, not separately, but as a lasagna. Like, there's different layers that add on top of each other to make a good recipe. You have residents on the low level, they're just doing their everyday thing. You have these community leaders, these churches, folks who are working with these residents or talking to these residents on a regular basis. And then you have those developers who are building those communities up, and organizations like us who are helping to be able to create access to different resources. So just looking at that recipe and saying, all of these things make a good lasagna. How can we put it together?
I love that analogy, Briana, with the lasagna. I would say the biggest challenge is twofold. The first one is scale. We're just one organization, right? And so there is so much need across the country that we can only do so much. And a lot of our partners, our nonprofit partners, are doing the same, but this is a very large country and this is a very big issue to address. And I would say the second thing is capital. The capital that we're able to provide has to be so flexible that it can be actually deployed. We know the interest rates are increasing. We know the standard lending institutions have covenants and requirements that most developers who are younger in their career or they haven't had the opportunity to do those larger projects just cannot overcome those barriers to entry. And so having capital and access to that is also so very important. And then the last thing that we talked about is the technical assistance. How do you get in front of the projects that come out and that are available to you before they're picked up? How do you interact with your local municipalities in a way in which you can get resources that some of your peers are receiving, but you don't know about because you may not have that relationship with the correct individuals or the correct municipalities? And so those are things that we're trying to address, but knowing that those are also challenges that we're still going to be addressing 5 years from now.
Right. So I don't want to leave this conversation, it's been so great, on the challenges. I'd like to leave it on the hopeful side of things. So I'd like to hear from both of you. What are you most hopeful about in this work, and where do you think the opportunity is as we move forward?
I'm hopeful that since there is a large presence and awareness in regards to quality, affordable housing in the United States, and also a large voice amongst young people around a lot of the racial equity issues and justice issues that we're having across the country, that this is going to rise to the top and that there's going to be other organizations that can take this work further, whether that is them partnering with Enterprise to be able to provide more resources through the Equitable Path Forward work, or being able to create programs that are addressing other issues that we're not able to tap into currently. So I'm hoping that that is going to be able to push this work.
And I would say that I'm hopeful about a couple of things. The first thing is that there's just a national awareness now of some of the racial equity issues that we've faced. I think I heard Briana say one time, we have basically ripped the Band-Aid off and we've exposed the wound. And so that now that more people are aware of some of the issues that are faced, I'm encouraged because we have partners that are coming to us that have never done this work before, saying, hey, we know you're experts in this field. We want to support the work that you're doing, but we're not necessarily sure how. Show us the way. And so the more people that we get like that, and we have had a lot of new partners come to us, that the more encouraged that I feel, because those are more resources that we can get out into our community. And once one boat rises, all boats rise.
Well, Melinda and Briana, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation today. So many great things. Is there any last words that either of you have before we finish?
Yeah, I would just say, for those who are not familiar with Enterprise and what we do, check out our website, enterprisecommunity.org. There's a lot of information there. Like I said, we operate in over 10 markets. So some of the big staples: Detroit, Mid-Atlantic, which includes DC and Baltimore, New York, Atlanta, California, and a lot of places would be interested in the work that we do and how we can help folks across the country.
Thank you again. We appreciate your time and your expertise, and we're inspired by the work that you're doing, and look forward to hearing more about Equitable Path Forward and the impacts and the successes you've had. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you, Cindy.
I'd like to thank Eric, Melinda, and Briana again for the great conversation. We covered a lot of ground, So before we end, I want to take a minute to pull out some key ideas. First, centuries of racism and discriminatory policies cannot be fixed overnight. As a result of these policies, there is a generational and network poverty issue that makes it more likely for people of color to end up unhoused. Second, bad policy solutions to homelessness, including criminalization, affect everyone, but impact some communities, especially people of color, more because of institutional racism and inequities in other systems. Third, the path forward needs to be inclusive and comprehensive. The focus should be on building more affordable housing and on building community wealth by providing BIPOC developers with the capital, skills, and resources they need to succeed. We'll end with one final message that we heard in both interviews. Bad policies hurt us all. Good policies help us all. Or as Melinda said, when one boat rises, all boats rise. You can learn more about these topics by reading through the weekly one-pager, which will include links to the National Homelessness Law Center and Enterprise's Equitable Path Forward initiative.